Hey, welcome back to Last Month in Security. I've got with me, of course, our CISO, Ben Carr, Chief Security and Trust Officer for Halcyon. We've also got our Senior Director of Product Marketing, Steve Salinas, and our very special guest, Sam Curry, who is the CISO at Zscaler. Sam, welcome.
And good to be here. Thanks for having me. Yeah.
Thank you for being our guinea pig on the first remote session we've done, as we usually do these in the studio in Southern
I should
California.
message you and be like, what? I can't quite hear you.
Yeah. No. I'm expecting something like that to happen here eventually. Thank you very much for joining us. We've got some things to talk about. I mean, and in security, things never stop, right? So before we jump into a couple of the topics, Sam, do you just want to give us a little brief history on you and what you're doing, what you've done before, and how it's going over there at Zscaler?
Yeah, if you want to double click on anything though, let me know. So I did cryptanalysis, and I was one of the very first employees for a VPN, and it's ironic now, a VPN and firewall company. Actually, one of the inventors of the desktop firewall, and we sold that to McAfee, where I was chief security architect, and I was head of product for the .com division. It was the third most successful .com. And then from there, I moved from California over to New York. I was at CA with their security business unit. It was called eTrust. And then perhaps what I'm most famous for is my RSA years. I ran RSA labs at MIT. I ran the product group and then switched over to be the CTO. And that was through the tough years, including the breach. Following that, I did a small stint at MicroStrategy as head of engineering and CISO. I was at Arbor Networks as CTO and CISO, and then Cybereason, where you and I, Anthony, had a chance to meet and work together. I have.
That's right.
I'm a teacher, so I teach at Wentworth Institute of Technology and at Nichols College, and I'm a fellow at the National Security Institute, and I sit on a few boards as well. But I've been a customer of Zscaler's twice, and I was involved in the A round through EMC RSA. So yeah, it's a whole bunch of stuff just thrown out there. So if you want to drill into any of it, let me know.
Yeah, and being that I know your background, that was only a tiny part of it. So.
Oh yeah, we all have stuff. We all have skeletons in the closet. So I'm paying you good money not to share it all. It's
right. Last time we were on a podcast together, we were celebrating the 10-year anniversary of the RSA breach, and
I still have flashbacks.
We did a special show with you, me, and Art, and a few others who were there for that. That was super interesting because nobody had been able to talk about it for 10 years. So
we actually had 10-year personal NDAs. Yeah, we had to sign those during the incident because there was nothing ever like it up until that point. Yes, there had been breaches, but there was no model or template for what to do, and so we were perhaps overcorrecting with the controls that we put and trying to find pathways to share information that we thought was certainly career-ending, but possibly also going to affect a giant of IT's, shareholders, EMC, which is now Dell. But at the time, and for clarity for anyone listening, that was 13 years ago now. We were making up the playbook as we went. And in fact, the language is still used by people, even though I think they could use better and more up-to-date language now with the benefit of hindsight.
Well, there's a Wired article out there about that. If you want to go Google it, find
Andy
it.
Greenberg wrote it, yeah.
Yep, and a Malicious Life podcast that was really good. So go check that out. Today, we're going to jump in with talking about probably one of the biggest attacks as far as impact that's happened here in this last month, the attack on Blue Yonder, right? So Blue Yonder is supply chain management software for over 3,000 organizations, big companies, Walgreens, Albertsons, DHL, Anheuser-Busch, and of course, Starbucks. And I found it interesting that, going through the Twitter, or X as it's called now, feed that morning, I saw more tweets about Starbucks being down than I think I'd seen since NotPetya or maybe WannaCry. It was, don't mess with people's coffee, right?
Yeah, if you can't get your coffee, I mean, what the hell? Like, that's a bad day, right? That's worse than, exposing PII and, all the corporate data out there. You can't get a mocha frappa.
I propose coffee is
nonstop.
critical infrastructure, so that we'll take that angle here.
That's the 17th domain, right? And coffee.
We've got kind of two different things. There's attacks on a critical supply chain target like Blue Yonder that impacts downstream customers of theirs. But then there's also supply chain attacks like we saw with Kaseya and SolarWinds, where a vendor is breached and then their network is basically used to push out, something nasty like a ransomware payload or something. So maybe talk a little bit about, what's the difference between an attack chain provider and a supply chain attack.
I think the important thing to realize is that there's a general, well, first of all, a classic supply chain has a lot to do with supply chain and manufacturing, right? We tend to think about how you assemble things and how you bring them together. And that goes back to, certainly in World War II, we really looked at this very, very closely in sabotage. We looked at things like ball bearing factories and what they did to things downstream. And so it's an old art. And in fact, if you look at intelligence, this is really actually quite interesting. Some of our own intelligence agencies, they began with the data that was collected by insurance companies. So it was the actuarial information that led to the information base to know where to drop bombs on our opponents, right, on our enemies. But now we're in an age where it's not so much a supply chain as a mesh. We have far more complex interactions and potentially cascades and chaotic effects when things go wrong. NotPetya was a good example of this, right? When look at the cascade effect when one application around financial services had an issue, what it did downstream and what it did to it's not even downstream at that point, what it did to the entire mesh or matrix. At one point I was trying to coin a term of a supply matrix because it is one part goes and it has a ripple effect, almost like waves through the economy. But now we also have this notion of digital interfaces, right? So APIs, I think, are underappreciated and people aren't looking at them enough. API security. APIs are effectively a new control area if we develop them correctly. I think that there's a general anonymization that happens. It's just like the marketplace for apps once upon a time in the mobile world. You pass a certain bar for security and privacy, and then what you find is you're never going to pass it again because people are stuffing too much into it. And the same thing is happening here, sometimes intentionally that way. And I think SBOM, we didn't even really get that finished, by the way. But
just move right on past it.
Yeah, we moved it's like, what was that, right? But we aren't doing enough to develop that. We could be doing so much more with that as a new area for fertile innovation, and we're just not. And so, now we're moving into an age of AI and data being shared. Think about where that information is going. I used an example the other day of we're going to have personal assistants. It's coming. This will be very intelligent, very integrated to our lives. They will know us not only better than our spouses, but better than we know ourselves. Now, what happens if you go through a divorce or you go through a legal proceeding or maybe you're on stand for a crime? Can you subpoena and put on the witness stand a personal assistant? Should we be designing for that or not up front? This is reminiscent of the trusted third party argument once long ago, right? So if you build it as an exploitable backdoor architecturally, it's an exploitable backdoor architecturally. Just want to emphasize that. So there's so much to unpack here, Anthony. I'm not entirely sure which way you were thinking. So that's my first.
There's a lot. And just a note on that, can you subpoena the personal assistant? I mean, we've seen subpoenas for Alexa data, even though Alexa's not supposed to collect data. And of course, that was a big drama. Then, that's some heavy foreshadowing that Sam's throwing out there. What's your take on that?
Look, I think it's certainly something that's going to happen, right? I mean, if you think of any capture device or any, technology that we're using that relates information together, like law enforcement, people who are suing someone else, like that's certainly going to become part and parcel to what we capture. And I think it's going to be even more important to threat actors, right? Like if they can capture that information and then use that information in some type of way to monetize, they'll certainly do that, right? Like we've seen that in ransomware. That's why ransomware has manifested itself to where it is. And I think we're going to see that attempt to capture more and more unique information that wouldn't otherwise be had. And, like I mentioned your thoughts, Sam, but like I've certainly seen over the last 20 years, people are more and more willing to give up their private information without even a concern, right? People will sign a EULA and they don't even care what's in the EULA, right? So, like, what's the worth of the EULA? What's the worth of the data you're giving up? All of our data is out there, right? And we
Oh,
don't seem to care
totally.
anymore. It's
It,
frustrating.
people don't really understand for instance, if you speak to somebody who has a mobile phone, there's one iPhones, right? I mean, I was stunned to find out how much money is made off of one user of an iPhone in a
Yeah.
given year. It is over $2,000, and most people go,
And
"Wait."
that's not the hardware.
And that's not the hardware. No, we haven't even factored in the hardware, right? This is the ecosystem around it. The mere existence of it in the ecosystem generates that kind of money. That's on average. The first year is closer to 4,000, right? And so just the presence of it is an economic stimulus. And the same thing is true, by the way, for all sorts of things. But your data is that way. And so I actually wrote a paper years ago, a guy named Joe Marino, about, do you have inherent digital rights? Now, by the way, you don't have any inherent rights, but are we going to fight to establish the notion of rights to your data? And we extended a property model that, just as you have eminent domain and you have rights to your property and use of that property, you perhaps had the same with respect to data about you and about how you interact with others, and that others can't simply say, well, I recorded it, therefore I can use it, it's my data. No, it may inherently be yours if we fight to establish that notion. But think about the Fourth Amendment. I mean, yes, Ben, I agree with you. It's obvious what's going to happen in the black and white case of, like, well, we're dealing with an opponent and we're dealing with an adversary who's going to exploit you and do bad things. But I also remember the spyware wars of the early 2000s, right? And Coast and the Anti-Spyware Coalition. And in those days, there were companies that set themselves up with legal departments, and they would 180 Solutions was one, right? That would set up, and they had a product called Zango, and it would sit there and it would suck stuff off your computer, and they were actually covered as a top small business of the year, right, by Fortune. And they had 200 employees. They were approaching 200 million in revenue. That's a staggering ratio per head. The way we were doing it was spyware. And later, of course, they went out of business because things caught up, largely due to things like the Anti-Spyware Coalition. But it's the same thing here. And so where does the Fourth Amendment come in, right? Just as we have to fight to say, do you have a right for lawful intercept on the internet, extended from wiretap days, we're not going to have that exact same thing when it comes to supply chain, when it comes to AI, when it comes to the new set of tools, especially agentic, that's coming.
Of
Well,
course,
I'll challenge
with
you on that, though,
everything,
right?
the
'Cause
technology.
Please do.
sorry, I go back to the
Go
EULAs
ahead,
though,
Ben.
right? Like that's where I think the real problem comes in is that I would agree that we probably would generally hope that if it went to court, right, goes up to the Supreme Court eventually, and somebody would say, yes, like you have the right to maintain your data. Somebody can't just come and siphon it off of your device and collect it without your knowledge. But what somebody's going to step up and say, but for the EULA, you signed away your rights and you willingly did it. And you got some type of an exchange in goods or services, right? Like people think Facebook's free. Facebook isn't free, my friends. Facebook charges, but they charge because of the data you share, they then monetize and sell, right? And I don't necessarily have a problem with that, but the challenge becomes when you dive down in the conceptual deep information of what a EULA is and the fact that, like, you and I, Sam, could have a disagreement or agreement on something. We could sign a contract and we could go through it, you and me, and kind of figure it out. But the problem is, I'm not having a contract discussion with you or me. I'm having a contract discussion with Facebook, Microsoft, Google, AWS. And as a consumer, you're not going to win that, right? And so, yeah, okay, I don't want to participate and I don't want to be able to do a Google search, but then I have no access to data and I'm at a disadvantage from every other citizen, right? And so that's,
Or
I
even
think, where
a savvy.
By the way, I fully agree with you. However, I mentioned the Anti-Spyware Coalition earlier. Those EULAs in those days were all caps, 130 pages, no punctuation, and I mean, nobody could read them. Now, the reason I said inherent rights and I kind of hesitated is because there is no constitutional amendment that protects privacy. There just isn't one. And so we have to fight to make it a right, at which point we can build jurisprudence on it. I'm not a lawyer. I don't think any of us is. If there is, by the way, Ben, if you are, I apologize. But like,
No.
at this,
I practice for free and do.
I didn't mean anything bad by it, by the way.
Yeah.
It was, I mean, we're armchair lawyers at best, right? But but there is no jurisprudence on this, and even when there is, we have to fight to reassert it with every new generation of technology. And so, like, we used to say, well, we don't need special laws for online crime because old world crime applies. Well, not until it's tested in the courts with common law. And so at some point, we're going to see, do these things stand up? Because I also wonder, do we have, now that, I heard this term years ago, Homo sapiens informaticus, right? Like the human experience at today, and actually it's a bit out of context. It was a Scientific American article, and what it meant to have a human experience now is essentially an information one, where part of what we are is integrated with the services that we have. Is it in fact cruel and unusual punishment today to take somebody offline? Is it the equivalent of putting somebody into isolation? And is that something we can and should do? And
If you're a teenager, they would not argue with you there.
Well,
But
were
this
there
brings
no
you
new
to-
laws in Florida
It's
where you
different,
can't,
right? I mean, like
like,
we're all
yeah,
of an
they're
age
not
where I
allowing
think
it.
like we grew up
Yeah.
without cell phones, without like fully connected environments. Like I remember going to the mall and your mom would
it's
tell
still
you to
hard
meet
for
you at
us.
4 o'clock somewhere, and if you weren't there, like they had no idea where you were, right? And we used,
Oh yeah, we were
hey,
bad. Our parents were bad parents if they couldn't find you the same day.
that's right, yeah,
Like
yeah.
now it's if you can't
Now
find you in
it's
the
like
next 5 minutes. Yeah.
they're on all the time, right? And so the experience, I think to Sam's point, it's a different experience, right? It really is like people born today have no concept of not being connected all the time.
Like honestly, the your Miranda rights entitle you to a phone call, but phones didn't exist originally, and if they had tried to write them, what would it have been? A letter to your lawyer, right? So now, as new technology comes out, are there future rights to be discovered as the human experience evolves? And I think the answer is yes, right? So what are they, and how do we determine new ones, especially when we can't get a plurality in the legislative
Well,
body? So let's
that's
just
it.
put that to one
Are those
side.
rights inherent, or are they something that have to be codified? We know that legislation takes a long, long time, and usually by the time it's out, when it has to do with technology, it's incomplete or already obsolete. And then the legal system takes even longer than that, right?
Well, Ben made a great point, by the way, which is, hey, I agree, you agree, we wrote it down, that's a contract, right? So there's only two other ways that these things, that could potentially be overridden. One is jurisprudence. The courts themselves effectively create law, whether we like to say it or not, but they do through their rulings. And they can modify law that way. And the other one is legislative, which means we have to find that plurality and be able to make it happen. But that takes a will. I mean, somebody out there has to get so passionate that they create a new amendment to the Constitution in our system.
There's a big shortage of knowledge about this space, in the Senate, in the House of Representatives. I can think of maybe
society.
two or three that.
Well, and that is a big problem. I mean, with the let's face it, the age of our government, our governing officials, they're not up to date on this stuff. And it's hard to expect that they would be, right? So anything they come up with is a decade too late or completely off base. And but it's funny you guys mentioned these EULAs because I just recently set up an Xbox, maybe for myself. And I'm setting a game, and this EULA just went on and on and on. There's just no way anyone's going to.
No, you're not. You're like, where's the down button?
Come on, next. And
I always chuckle because they say you have to go all the way.
You have to do
down.
it. Yeah.
Like, why? Is it just to
Well, it's
prove
like
that I
implied-
could push it
implied
down?
Perception that you read it, right? So they can stand up if
Even
you
my
present-
dumb TV,
Like,
my
you must have
TV
read it,
somehow
you scrolled
updated and
through
said,
it,
"Oh,
yeah,
agree to
proof."
this."
So there's jurisprudence somewhere that says that that's enough. But
Yeah.
let's all just admit, I just consciously went, all right, I'm scrolling down because you want me to say that I actually went through it when we all know I didn't.
Yeah, I just want to play Call of Duty. It's like,
and what
just
would
let
you
me
do
get
if you
there,
had a problem
it's
with
like-
it? Are you calling or writing a letter?
Can't even
or
take a
fi-
screenshot.
Formulating a complaint with Electronic Arts or Sony or whoever it is that you have a problem with their EULA? Like, no, you're not. I mean, you just want to play a game, Steve.
So this boils down to a problem I had when we did the desktop firewall, which is an interstitial pop-up that says, do you want to allow this? Boils down to, do you want to continue doing the thing you want to do or not?
yeah.
Basically,
The answer is
Yeah,
always
yeah.
yes.
It's
always
a blocker,
yes.
right? Yeah, of course.
In fact, it might even be, do you want to take the chance that I'm going to stop something you want to do? And the answer for that is, well, no. So you allow it.
I have a question about this attack. I'm just curious. So Blue Yonder, it's obviously disrupting the supply chain. Do we think the attackers attack them because they're in the supply chain, or because they have such a diverse environment and they were just an easier target and they don't really care that they've disrupted the supply chain? Or because when I think about disrupting supply chain, it's maybe more of like not necessarily for ransom, but just to cause mayhem or to cause some sort of disruption. But is it just they were such a rich? There was a
thought
lot
Ben
of
shook his head
opportunity to
immediately.
be.
Yeah, I
What do you think,
I
Ben?
gave my tail. Sorry, I don't play poker.
What do you
well.
think?
Your tail came out. Yeah.
You look, I'm interested into what you say, Sam, but like, I think generally they're just taking advantage of who they can. And I just have the belief that the initial access brokers, or, the people in the RAS economy, I don't necessarily think that if they're looking at Blue Yonder and say, oh, Starbucks is critically dependent on them. I actually don't think that information is as transparent necessarily as we think it is. Like, when we're in the tech side, we have a lot more information about the relevance of different organizations. But if you look back at Change Healthcare, I think a lot of people went, who the hell is Change Healthcare and why can't I get my prescription? Like, I don't have any relationship with Change Healthcare, right? And so I guess the question is, will it become an impetus, right? Because they see that the interdependency, the matrix, if you will, is so connected that it's actually more impactful to go after what's almost critical infrastructure of connection, versus the end point of like, this is an enterprise company that sells me something, right? But if I attack the interconnection, I'm attacking 20 enterprises that deliver a bunch of people something, right? And so it's more important. I just don't think,
Creates that
I don't
sense
think
of
they've
urgency.
elevated that way yet, but I imagine they certainly will when they see the monetization behind it. Do you agree,
So
Sam?
two things occur to me here. I totally agree with you. We have as a species a habit to impute motive after the fact. It's just a bias. It's a failing. So when we see something come out, we go, that must have been causal and intentional. It usually isn't, by the way.
Yeah, it's looking
This
for
is
the
true of our
pattern, right?
careers. Yeah. So when you asked me my bio earlier, the temptation is to tell a narrative, right? Because you want to seem like you were smart and you made choices, but most of that was random, by the way. We also ask people, so what do you want to do in 5 years? Because, well, clearly you'd be stupid if you didn't have a plan. Most of us don't have a plan, by the way. We don't. Like, for everyone out there who's like, boy, these guys have got it together. We didn't. All right. But like, the same is true here, that you could literally just sort of throw a stick of dynamite and things will bubble to the surface and they'll be like, boy, that was accurate. Right. And so what is Blue Yonder? Well, the thing about them is that they're in the supply chain business, right? And what happens in peacetime is the boardroom and C-levels are incented to maximize margin. And the way that you maximize margin is you go to less suppliers. And what happens in any economic system is you wind up with less complexity in your supply chain. So here in the United States, for instance, our food supply chain, there's 2 of them. 2. If you go to Europe, there's 15. We used to have a dozen, not that long ago, about 20 years ago. So now we alluded to critical infrastructure. If you throw a wrench in one of them, it has a tremendous catastrophic effect downstream. That's that cascade effect. So throwing the grenade, there's more in the pond, right? So I'm inclined to say, absent proof, I'm not going to say this was intentional. And so I want to go look for it, and whoever's investigating and looking at these things in general should. But the temptations to go, well, it must have been intentional, right? And
I would characterize the majority of ransomware attacks as attacks of opportunity.
look at Columbia Pipeline, right? So the case of the Columbia gas pipeline attack, I don't know if they were dumb, more likely just ignorant. And they didn't realize the 45% of the East Coast that relied on that and the impact it had on things like the price of gas.
There's been a lot of people saying that came out after that, like somewhat recently, not too recently after that, but it came out and said, look, it was actually an indication that those actors didn't intend to cause that much damage. And when they realized what they had done, they were actually like, oh, crap, we woke the bear, right? Like, we don't want to raise that level of alarm. And I think that's,
Putin did not appreciate being mentioned in a press conference by the president of the United States alongside ransomware.
I think he's used to it now, but back then you're right. Yeah.
But motive and opportunity, right? Like, I think, look, they're trying to get money out of it. If they make it difficult or harmful to get money out of it, then that's a bad outcome for them, right? So they're different than a nation state actor that I certainly think that, look, if they weren't already aware of it, which I have to believe they were, but nation states have now seen, hmm, if things went in a way that we wouldn't want them to go, these are the areas we would focus on because they cause the most pain and damage, right?
So let's
Ball
play a
bear.
little. Let's play a game with this. Let's play a little game with this. Imagine you are R&D for nation state lab for some dark nefarious nation, right? And you've got to spend $100 in an R&D. What do you spend it on? Legitimately, what do you spend it on? What are you going to develop exploits for? Or what are you going to invest? Let's imagine you want to try and disrupt the internal affairs of a country. Remember, let's say you've got your dictator for life who's going to come up and say, I want options. What have you developed for me?
Yeah. Food, power, water, right? I mean, it's
Food, power, water, right? And generally speaking, you're going to go after things. And by the way, so what are your general choices at a high level? Okay, you've got military. Well, that leaves a smoking hole in the ground and people come back for you, right? You've got trade, treaties, those sorts of things. But cyber's a good one because it gives you very little cost and lots of things you can go attack.
Lots of plausible deniability. This is a great segue into my next question for you.
Oh, but hang on, there's more before you do. We're going to that question.
Okay, go.
Because
Go ahead.
what you target is the things that have ubiquity, that have access, that have power. And so, yeah, you're right. By the way, you go after certain critical infrastructure that you mentioned, Anthony, and we'll come to your question in a second, but you also go after the tools that are everywhere. You go after the things that put you in and around with the most access you can get. You go after, you mentioned SolarWinds earlier. Why? Because it gets you in where you want. You go in and you go after a firewall vendor because you pop it and you're in the whole network.
Well, to
That's
use your
why
term,
when you go look at, you can literally
attacking
go
that
look.
matrix, right?
Yeah, you can go look at the CVEs and they're ranked. You could go, wow, what do they have in common at the top? It's not that they're bad companies. It's that they have maximal access and power when popped. So, Anthony, I'm sorry I interrupted you, though. You had a
No,
follow-up
that's
question.
fantastic. I was just gonna go. I wrote a blog the other week. Basically, can we stop pretending that Russia and China and other adversarial nations are not influencing some of these ransomware attacks? Right, not all. Ransomware attacks are definitely financially motivated, but we've seen plenty of instances where, and I'll use this as an example. Okay, Russia will start there, tipping their hand. Of course, we saw the big dip in the number of ransomware attacks right at the onset of the invasion of Ukraine, right? Kind of an indication that they may
Also,
have
a
been,
polarization of the cybercrime community around those
because
two
they
poles.
had
Not
been
all,
working
a lot.
together, Ukrainians and Russians.
It looked like filings around a magnet, right? They suddenly went boom.
yes.
Exactly. What was really interesting, very recently, last couple of weeks, Stoli, the vodka brand, suffered a major ransomware attack. Now, just to take it back a little bit, Putin's been on Stoli for a long time. They kind of divested themselves from Russia. They moved their operations overseas. This goes all the way back to like the year 2000. Putin wants to reclaim the Stoli trademarks. He's been just making their life miserable from a legal standpoint. Basically repossessed $100 million worth of two distilleries that were still located in Russia. And what's funny about with all this going on, then they suffer a major ransomware attack about the same time. Is that just a coincidence, or are we seeing some flex there in influencing this targeting? And then the other one I'll throw out is China, of course, and the U.S. just announced sanctions against a Chinese cybersecurity firm, Szechuan Silence, they're called, who was participating to some extent in the Ragnarok ransomware attacks a while back and stuff, leveraging 0 days sequence. I mean, definitely bringing in some of these what were tradecraft that's usually APT kind of stuff, nation state actor stuff, and we're seeing more blurring. So Volt Typhoon. So U.S. government comes out and says China is in our critical infrastructure making these attacks. China says, no, it was a ransomware group, right? Plausible deniability because attribution is hard. When can we stop expecting, let's say, the DOJ to handle this problem when it's really a national security issue, clearly, at least from my perspective?
So I would say look to history for a precedent. This is not unprecedented. It happened in the world of terrorism. By the way, my master's is in counterterrorism. It happened in the world of terrorism, where you get the non-state actors at arm's length for plausible deniability. You get the training, you get the equipping, you get the sharing know-how, right? You get the ramping up in operations. It's exactly the same, by the way. And it's human nature. And so what happens is it continues until you get a change in the alignment of nations with one another, new international norms, changes in policy, changes in administration, and so on. That happens when the elected officials, usually at an administration change. See, the thing about US administrations, as opposed to many of our allies, is they go deeper when they change. Like, if you've ever seen Yes Minister in the UK or Yes Prime Minister, have you ever watched the show?
Yeah, I haven't seen that.
The civil service stays the same, and they just change the guy at the top.
Yeah, it goes to the top.
Right? It doesn't go as deep. There's a few hundred people that change when you change a British or Canadian or Australian administration. There's a book by Michael Lewis called Fifth Risk, The Fifth Risk, and the change goes thousands of people deep in the U.S. civil service. It does lead to policy changes. It also leads to a period of freshman years, right? You get this instability and unpredictability to some degree in foreign affairs. And if a savvy administration can take advantage of that, by the way, when dealing with opponents, because a little crazy is pretty good sometimes in diplomacy. And yeah, I said it, right? So when will it happen? Well, it happens when some of the policy thinkers get a chance to rewrite the book, usually an administration change. That's my opinion. I'd love to hear what you guys think.
So interestingly, and I think I've referenced it before in a couple of our conversations. So I read Richard Clark's book, Fifth Domain, right? And it was really interesting when he talked about that the policy of U.S. cyber hasn't really changed for the last several administrations. It's been the one thing that's been fairly consistent, right? And I found that super interesting, right? And it's almost like,
Although on his watch, we made it an act of war. That was under Obama.
yes, but the difference is it's almost
Then it was qualified with the correct response is another cyber response.
Yeah.
that's true.
It's a fifth rail, right? Like, I think no one wants to actually, you call it fifth domain, but I think fifth rail is almost more appropriate of like, no one wants to touch it and say, look, you've crossed the line into changing this into a kinetic thing, right? And I think that's the concern. There's been this level of detente that's existed. The Cold War forever, whatever you want to think about it, was fairly successful, right? We didn't have a major outbreak between world powers that resulted in a global thermonuclear war, killing everyone. And I think the challenge is like, it's kept everybody like just precipitously back from that edge. And I don't know. I'm concerned that we're closer because cyber bleeds over, right? And no one wants to call it what it is.
Well, and just to be fair, the U.S. and our allies are leveraging this ambiguity as well. We're just
everybody's
also not out
leveraging
there.
it, right?
So,
I mean,
so
like,
there's some differences. There's some big differences between the Cold War and now, because there were less players in that game. It was more of a polar arrangement. Yes, there were other players, but there were the big five, and then a few others got added, right? India, Pakistan, Israel, South Africa, etc. But like, for the most part, there were less players. Also, it's hard to deny when there's a smoking hole in the ground in a mushroom cloud that it's happened, and you can trace the fissile material to where it came from, right? So you can't exactly go, well, I didn't do it.
they backed away from the attribution, I guess, right? Now that's what it always comes back to. It's really hard to allow organizations or commercial entities to hack back because of well, you could be causing a bigger problem with missed attribution, right? And I think governments want to kind of stay out of it, and alternatively, governments use that lack of easy attribution to say, oh, it wasn't us, right? It was a criminal organization, when the criminal organization is well funded and we know they walk across the street from one building to the next, right? It's
By the way, there was a debate that has gone up almost to the present, I would say, on whether there's such a thing as cyber war. And I used to be very upset with cyber weapons of mass destruction talk and all the rest. But the reason was because, if you had to pick, did you want to have a nuclear weapon dropped on you or a cyber weapon, you'd choose cyber weapon all the time, right? Because what does that mean? You lose power for a bit? But now, what happened with the Ukraine conflict is that there was some cyber saber rattling going on, where the U.S. actually said that they could do medium to high damage with a cyber arsenal. That was a first in terms of the saber rattling and potential. And there's been talk of it being more than that. Every war that Russia has engaged in, and there's been, I think, almost 11 now since the fall of the Soviet Union. There's been an electronic warfare component. And so what they do is they blast the radio stations, they take out the TV stations, they jam the airwaves. There's also been a cyber component. And what that means is it just like electronic warfare, it's your guardrail, or your fifth rail rather than a fifth domain. But I think we may be on the verge now, finally, of getting into a fifth domain, right? Or maybe sixth if you count, depending on how you count space.
Which
right?
rotates a little bit back towards the beginning of the conversation we had, right? Of this potential for it to the supply chain really to be that ultimate critical infrastructure component of bringing something down where you cripple a country, right? So you can imagine somebody wants to take something hot. The first thing they do is they go in with a massive cyber attack to cripple the ability of a population to exist the way it has prior to that event, right? And that could be very problematic for a country. Much rather have to deal with that and get their people back up versus have to deal with something, in a kinetic arena somewhere else.
Yeah, how long does it take, not just denying whatever digital rights you may or may not have, how long does it take until society effectively deteriorates and turns to something more primitive?
I'm curious what you guys think. So I think we talked a little bit about this last time. We talked a lot about the government's response and the government. I think just in our lives, and I'm speaking for myself, I don't know if the government is very efficient in taking care of any of these problems, right? So looking to the government to really be the answer to this is probably a little bit Pollyannish in my view. I think
Come
that's why
on,
we
Steve,
see these
we're the government and
organizations.
we're here to help. The best words
Right.
ever, right?
That's scary, right? So I think probably these organizations of Blue Yonder, whatever it is, they got to man up, woman up, whatever, and take care of it themselves. Can't assume the government's going to be the savior. I don't think in any of this stuff.
Well,
right?
so
I mean,
to some degree, I agree. There are some things we do trust government to do, though, and the question I think is this one of them?
I guess that would be my point. They don't know a lot about this domain.
Yeah,
right?
we trust it. We trust the government to do foreign affairs, right? Better or worse. We trust the government to manage a military, better or worse. We also trust it with peacekeeping, right? Like police and fire. Is this one of them? Because I'll tell you, I was on the receiving end of at least one very public attack by a nation state. And my CEO said publicly, no company can stand up to a nation state.
Correct.
So what is the answer there? Because
More and you're not really
gut says
allowed to, right? If you're allowed to, you're allowed to try to do what you can to defend and get yourself.
Or
back
I
up
don't mean hack back. I mean even just defend.
But and it's really hard, right? Like defending is super hard when you're essentially handicapped.
Well, so let's say you do the zero trust right. You have no extra function available. You've minimized your access. Got it, right? And you do all of your security the right way, and you're protecting all your people. Now you have to face a nation state. Your people are traveling all over the world, right? Comprimat. People will take pictures of them and blackmail them and bribe them. And we had that threat for 7 of our employees during that incident. This is not
that's
a joke.
Obviously,
how do you stand up to a nation state? You've done it all right.
Some of it, I think, comes back to having the right people in government that understand the domains well enough to can help define those regulations and things you guys were talking about earlier, right? I mean, I think, but
I think we can all agree we need more than frameworks and guidelines here and occasional DOJ indictments against.
Right.
Sure. I just don't think in the
random
short term that's
actors.
really going to be the outcome, right? I think really in the short term, it's going to be up to each entity to kind of look out for themselves as best they can and hope that this starts, manifesting in some additional advice, support, work at the governmental and regulatory level.
Yeah, to Sam's point, though, it's just not a fair fight, right?
So I think what you have to do is you have to do the best you can, and you have to be strong to a point that is considered reasonable. But so in order to have cracked RSA when I was there prior to the internet, the nation state in question would have either had to have infiltrated the building with a mole, several of them, or sent commandos on a submarine up the Merrimack. But no, they found other ways to do it because technology advanced, right? Now, how do we deal with countries that do have those sorts of resources? Because the only way to deal with that is to actually start to use the tools that are available to a nation state. So to your point, Steve, I'm not entirely sure where the line is drawn, but we aren't drawing it right now.
Well, from people I know in that space, from what I understand, we obviously could do a lot more than we're doing, but we don't because there's implications for it, right? There's escalation. There's and the potential that something cyber could become something a real military response, right? So there's a lot at stake here in how you use cyber, how you react to a cyber incident and stuff. And I don't think we've put our finger on really how to deal with this at all.
That doesn't mean that we aren't fighting it, and that doesn't mean that we aren't stopping it. It means
right.
that at the very top end of the game, we can see a line of sight to where more is going to be needed.
Absolutely. I can't believe this much time went by. I hate to cut this conversation off with you, Sam, because
I'm sure I
it's
said a
been
few things that'll get me in trouble, so we haven't done enough of that, and we'll do it again sometime.
That's always the intent.
We really appreciate your time, Sam. Thanks for joining us again. Sam Curry, the CISO for Zscaler. Check them out. Fantastic product. Sam, thanks again
for having
your
me.
time. Take care.